Master silence in 25 minutes. Inner steel. There is a man standing in the middle of a courtroom. The judge has just delivered a verdict that could ruin him. The crowd murmurs. The prosecutor smirks. Every eye in the room waits for his collapse, for the crack, the tears, the outburst. And then, nothing. The man simply nods. He says nothing. He turns. He walks out. And everyone in that room, including the judge, feels something they did not expect to feel: fear. Not fear of the verdict. Fear of him. Because silence, true silence, earned silence, chosen silence, is the most powerful thing a human being can carry. You cannot buy it. You cannot fake it. And most people will never possess it. But today, right now, in the next 25 minutes, you are going to learn how. My name is not important. What is important is what you're about to understand, something that the Stoics knew, that the samurai lived by, that the greatest minds in history return to again and again. Silence is not the absence of words. It is the presence of power. If what you learn here moves something inside you, subscribe to Inner Steel. We exist for one purpose: to forge men who cannot be rattled. Now let's begin. Point 1. Silence is not weakness. It is discipline in its purest form. In 168 BC, a Roman general named Lucius Aemilius Paulus stood at the edge of the Battle of Pydna. He had been awake for 3 days. His men were exhausted. The Macedonian phalanx, one of the most feared formations in the ancient world, stretched before him like a wall of iron. His officers wanted to charge immediately. They argued. They paced. They raised their voices in disagreement. And Paulus did something that none of them expected. He went quiet. Not the quiet of a man who doesn't know what to do, but the quiet of a man who knows exactly what he's doing and refuses to let noise corrupt it. He studied the terrain. He waited. And then, when the Macedonian formation broke its tight lines while crossing uneven ground, Paulus moved his legions with surgical precision through the gaps. The battle lasted 1 hour. Rome won. Perseus, the last king of Macedonia, was captured. An empire fell, because one man chose silence over noise when every instinct around him was screaming. Most men have been conditioned to believe that activity equals strength. That talking equals intelligence. That reacting fast means you're on top of things. But this is a trap. A loud trap. And millions of men spend their entire lives inside it, mistaking noise for competence, reaction for control, volume for confidence. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." Read that again. Not, say only what is useful. Say nothing unless it is true. That standard, that filter between thought and speech, is discipline. Not the discipline of the gym, not the discipline of waking at 5 a.m. This is the deepest discipline, the discipline of your own mouth. Of your own impulse. Of your own need to be heard. The man who masters this discipline becomes something rare. Something that draws attention precisely because it withholds attention. Because in a world where everyone is shouting, the man who is silent has the room's full curiosity. They wonder what he knows. They wonder what he's thinking. They wonder if they've already offended him. That psychological weight, that quiet authority, costs nothing to carry once you've earned it. But earning it requires you to understand something most men resist: you do not need to speak to exist. You do not need to respond to be respected. And you do not need to explain yourself to anyone who hasn't earned the explanation. Silence is not weakness. Silence is discipline wearing no uniform. Point 2. The man who controls his words controls the room. In 1815, Napoleon Bonaparte was exiled to the island of St. Helena. He had lost everything: his empire, his armies, his freedom. The British officer assigned to watch over him, Sir Hudson Lowe, was a rigid, officious man who constantly tried to provoke Napoleon into arguments. He questioned his expenses. He restricted his movement. He referred to him not as Emperor, but simply as General Bonaparte, a deliberate insult designed to strip him of his former identity. And what did Napoleon do? He refused to engage. He wrote his memoirs. He held his dinners with dignity. He referred to himself, always, as the Emperor. When visitors arrived from Europe, Low would watch, red-faced, as they still bowed to Napoleon, because the man's silence on the matter of his own dignity said more than any argument ever could. Low ranted. Napoleon wrote history. One man's name lives in gold. The other lives as a footnote of pettiness. This is the physics of silence that most men have never been taught. When someone tries to drag you into a conflict with words, every response you give is ammunition for them to reload. Every defense you offer is an admission that their attack has landed. But silence takes the gun out of their hand entirely. There is nothing to reload. There is nothing to counter. There is only you unmoved. Think of the last argument you had. Not the one you won. The one you can't stop thinking about. The one where you said something you wish you hadn't. Where you went too far, or didn't go far enough, or said the right thing the wrong way. Now ask yourself honestly, what would have happened if you had simply looked at that person, steady, calm, unbothered, and said nothing? Not a passive-aggressive nothing. Not a cold shoulder. Just the silence of a man who has already decided that this situation does not deserve his energy. In most cases, the other person would either escalate into embarrassing themselves, or they would deflate entirely. Because conflict needs two. Chaos needs permission. And the moment you withdraw your permission, the moment you remove your reaction from the equation, the fire has nothing to burn. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus, who was born a slave and broke every chain except the ones he chose to wear, said this: "We have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak." But he was not talking about being a good listener in the modern therapeutic sense. He was talking about information gathering, about intelligence, about understanding that the man who speaks less knows more, because he is constantly receiving while others are constantly broadcasting. In a negotiation, in a boardroom, in a relationship, in a conflict, the man who speaks first, speaks most, and speaks loudest is the man giving away the most. The man across from him, who sits quietly, who asks one careful question and then waits, that man is in control of the entire exchange. Control your words. Control the room. Point 3. Silence after being wronged is the highest form of power. In 1955, a seamstress in Montgomery, Alabama was asked to give up her seat on a bus. She refused. But here is the part most people forget: Rosa Parks did not shout. She did not argue. She did not create a scene. She sat. In silence. In absolute, unshakable silence. And that silence, that refusal to perform rage or fear or submission, became one of the most historically significant acts of resistance in the 20th century. The bus driver called the police. The police came. And she sat. She answered the questions she was legally required to answer. And then she said nothing more. Her silence was not compliance. It was not defeat. It was sovereignty. A woman deciding, in one quiet moment, that her dignity was not available for negotiation. You will be wronged in this life. This is not pessimism, this is physics. People will betray you. They will undercut you at work, lie about you behind closed doors, take credit for what you built, dismiss what you've earned, or simply treat you as less than what you are. And every single time this happens, the world will watch to see what you do. They will watch to see if you crack. If you rant on social media. If you beg for validation. If you fall apart in public. If you let them see the wound. The Stoics called this the dichotomy of control. What happens to you is not always in your hands. What you do with it, always is. And the greatest weapon you possess in the aftermath of being wronged is the ability to be still. Not because you don't feel it. Not because it doesn't hurt. But because you have decided that your response will be measured in results, not in noise. You will not tweet about it. You will not confide in people who can't help you. You will not waste energy explaining yourself to people who have already decided what they think. You will go silent. You will work. And you will let time and output do what words never could. There is a Japanese concept called enryo, The practice of deliberate restraint, of holding back feeling in order to preserve dignity and relationship. It is often mistranslated as politeness. But at its core, enryo is about self-possession. About choosing what you project into the world with almost surgical care. The man who practices enryo after being wronged does not become passive. He becomes precise. He decides, slowly, deliberately, what his next move will be. And when he moves with the full weight of everything he chose not to say. Silence after being wronged is not letting them off the hook. It is choosing your hook carefully. Point 4. The silent man is never manipulated. In the late 1800s, a young Otto von Bismarck, who would later become one of the most formidable political architects in European history, was described by his contemporaries as a man almost impossible to manipulate. Not because he was always the smartest person in the room, but because he spoke so rarely in social settings that his opponents could never read him. They didn't know his positions until he had already locked them in. They didn't know his alliances until they were already forged. And when he finally did speak, in Parliament, in private meetings, in dispatches, his words had already been shaped in silence into something near irresistible. His opponents were constantly reacting to a man who had already moved on to the next 3 steps while they were still processing what he had said. He manipulated the powerful of Europe not through deception but through deliberate silence that forced everyone else to fill the void with assumptions, and those assumptions were almost always wrong. Manipulation requires a target. And a target is a man who reveals himself, through his words, his reactions, his need for approval, his fear of disapproval. The man who says too much about what he wants tells the world exactly how to deny it to him. The man who reacts to every provocation tells the world exactly which buttons to push. The man who constantly explains himself tells the world that he is unsure of himself and seeking permission to feel valid. The silent man gives none of these handles. You cannot push a button you can't find. You cannot pull a lever that isn't visible. The man who moves through the world quietly, who listens more than he speaks, who gives little away, who never argues his position when he can simply hold it, that man becomes something that manipulators instinctively avoid, too uncertain, too unknown, too costly to target. Because manipulation is, at its root, a transaction. And the silent man is never cheap enough to make the transaction worth it. This does not mean becoming cold. It does not mean becoming socially barren or refusing to connect. It means understanding the difference between sharing and broadcasting. The man who shares, who selects what he reveals, to whom, and when, builds intimacy. The man who broadcasts, who tells anyone who will listen about his plans, his wounds, his ambitions, his fears, builds nothing but a map of his own vulnerabilities. Protect the map. Control the narrative. Let your results speak for what you refuse to. If these principles are landing for you, subscribe to Inner Steel. This channel is built for the man who is done being reactive and ready to become deliberate. Point 5. Silence teaches you what noise hides. In the 1940s, a young Viktor Frankl was stripped of everything in the Nazi concentration camps. His manuscripts were burned. His parents, his brother, his wife, taken. In the most devastating conditions a human being can endure, Frankl began to notice something. The men who survived, not just physically, but psychologically, were the ones who had found a way to go inward. To exist in the silence of their own minds without losing themselves. In the chaos of the camps, where guards screamed and prisoners wailed and the machinery of horror ran constantly, some men had learned to build an interior room that no one could enter. Not a room of fantasy or denial, but a room of reflection. Of meaning-making. Of quiet. And it was in that quiet, Frankl wrote, that they found the one freedom no system can strip, the freedom to choose one's response to one's conditions. He later called this the last human freedom. And it begins with silence. Most men spend their lives afraid of silence. They fill every gap, every commute, every meal, every moment before sleep, with sound. Podcasts, music, news, scrolling, talking, background noise. Not because they're building anything, but because they're afraid of what the silence would show them. Because in the silence, you cannot avoid yourself. You cannot run from the question, is this the life I meant to build? Is this the man I intended to become? Am I using my time, or am I using entertainment to avoid the fact that I'm not using my time? The Stoics practiced something called the view from above, a meditative exercise where you mentally rise above your life and look at it as it is, not as you tell yourself it is. This requires silence. Real silence. Enough quiet to let the uncomfortable truths surface and stay on the table long enough to be examined. And what most men find when they first do this, when they sit, genuinely, in silence for 20 minutes, is discomfort. And behind the discomfort, clarity. And behind the clarity, direction. The noise was protecting them from the direction because the direction demands change, and change is hard. Silence is not an absence. It is a curriculum. The man who learns to sit in it learns things about himself that no book, no therapist, no mentor can tell him, because some truths only arrive when you are still enough to receive them. Point 6. Silence in conflict is your sharpest weapon. In 399 BC, Socrates stood trial for allegedly corrupting the youth of Athens. He was 70 years old. He had spent his entire life questioning, probing, pushing ideas until they broke or held, and now the city he loved was calling him a criminal for it. His friends begged him to flee. They said he could escape to another city, continue his work, avoid execution. And Socrates sat in silence with the question. Not silence as avoidance. Silence as examination. When he finally spoke, in the trial itself, he delivered one of the most composed defenses in human history. Not an emotional plea. Not a performance. Not a negotiation. A calm, razor-precise articulation of who he was and what he stood for. He knew he would lose. He knew the jury was already decided. But he chose to speak not to save his life, but to stand as himself in the final hours of it. The silence before that moment had given him perfect clarity about what needed to be said. And what needed to be said was the truth, plainly, without ornament. Most men who enter conflict come in hot. They arrive loaded, with grievance, with emotion, with things they've been storing up. And in that state, they say things they can't unsay. They win arguments and lose relationships. They score points and miss the actual goal. And they walk out of the conflict having spent enormous emotional currency on something that moved nothing. The man who enters conflict in silence, who has paused, who has breathed, who has asked himself, what outcome do I actually want from this? Before he opens his mouth, that man is already operating at a level above the conflict. He has already separated himself from the emotion enough to be strategic. He is not reacting. He is responding. And there is a universe of difference between those two things. Reaction is the body running ahead of the mind. Response is the mind leading the body. Every martial artist knows this. The fighter who reacts loses to the one who responds, because reaction is always a fraction of a second too slow and a fraction of a degree off target. But the man who can sit inside the pressure of a moment, inside the heat of an accusation, a provocation, a threat, and choose when and how to move, that man is not just winning the fight. He is rewriting its terms. Silence in conflict is not pacifism. It is precision. Point 7. The loudest man in the room has the least to say. There is a moment in almost every gathering, in every meeting, every social event, every family dinner, when one man takes over the room with noise. He talks over people. He finishes sentences. He laughs loudest at his own observations. He offers opinions on everything, corrects people unnecessarily, and maintains constant verbal presence as if volume were the price of admission to being taken seriously. And everyone in the room performs interest. They nod. They laugh. They agree. And the moment he leaves, everyone's shoulders drop 2 inches. Because the performance was exhausting. This man is not powerful. He is loud. And those are not the same thing. The Roman statesman Cato the Elder, one of the most respected men of the Roman Republic, was known for speaking rarely in the Senate. When he did speak, silence fell. Not because of his title or his age. but because men had learned over years that when Cato spoke, it was because he had something worth saying. His silence between speeches was not absence, it was architecture. He was building the weight of his words by rationing them. Every time he stayed quiet when others would have spoken, he added a stone to the edifice. So that when he finally did speak, it landed like a monument. This is the economy of speech that most men have never been taught. Words are currency. And like all currency, their value is tied to scarcity. The man who speaks constantly devalues his words into noise. The man who speaks only when necessary, only when what he has to say is true, useful, or beautiful, makes every word worth listening to. People lean in when he speaks. They remember what he said. They repeat it. Not because he's more intelligent than the loudest man in the room, but because he has respected his own words enough to protect them. Silence is not the enemy of connection. It is the foundation of respect. And in a world drowning in content, commentary, and commentary about commentary, the man who holds his tongue is not behind, he is ahead. Farther ahead than he appears. And when he moves, everyone who dismissed his silence will understand, too late, what they were standing next to. Point 8. Silence builds the self that noise destroys. In 1849, a 27-year-old Fyodor Dostoevsky stood in front of a firing squad in St. Petersburg. He had been convicted of political conspiracy. He was blindfolded. He heard the loading of the rifles. And then, a pardon. A last-second commutation of his sentence to 4 years of hard labor in Siberia. He was led away from the wall and spent the next 4 years in almost total silence, stripped of books, of pen, of intellectual discourse, forced to exist in brutal physicality and internal thought. And out of that silence emerged one of the greatest literary minds in human history. He returned and wrote Crime and Punishment, The Idiot, The Brothers Karamazov, works that millions of people still read today because of the psychological depth they carry, depth that was built, Dostoevsky himself said, in the silence of Siberia. The version of you that the world sees is not the whole of you. It is the performance of you, the edited, social, responsive, reactive, externally oriented version. The real self, the one that knows what it actually wants, what it genuinely believes, what it fears and what it loves, that self is built in silence. It is the version you find when there are no mirrors, no audiences, no validation loops. Just you, in the quiet, examining your own mind without commentary. Most men have spent so little time in deliberate silence that they don't actually know who they are. They know their opinions, which were formed by the content they consume. They know their preferences, which were shaped by advertising, culture, and the people around them. But their actual character? Their core values? The things they would refuse to compromise even under enormous pressure? Those things have to be excavated in silence. And it is a different kind of silence than what we've talked about so far. Not the silence of restraint. Not the silence of conflict. This is the silence of construction. Of sitting with yourself long enough to build something real inside. The Stoic practice of journaling was not, primarily, about recording events. It was about interrogating the self. Marcus Aurelius did not write the Meditations for publication. He never intended anyone to read them. He wrote them to examine himself. To hold his own thinking up to scrutiny in the silence of private reflection. You have power over your mind, not outside events, he wrote. Realize this, and you will find strength. That power, the power over your own mind, is found in silence. Nowhere else. The man who builds his inner self in silence arrives in every room with more than presence. He arrives with foundation. And you can feel the difference between a man with foundation and a man without it, even if you can't explain what you're feeling. Foundation shows in stillness. It shows in how a man sits. How he listens. How he speaks when he does speak. How he moves when he does move. You cannot fake it. And you cannot build it in noise. Point 9. Silence is how you move without being seen. In the late 1500s, a Japanese swordsman named Miyamoto Musashi was renowned not just for his fighting ability, but for something his opponents found deeply unsettling: his silence before a duel. Most fighters talked. They postured. They made noise to manage their own fear and perform confidence. Musashi arrived in silence. He sat in silence. He waited in silence, sometimes making his opponents wait for hours, disturbing their rhythm, unraveling their composure before a single blade was drawn. He understood something elemental. A man who does not reveal himself cannot be countered. A man who is still cannot be read. And a man who cannot be read cannot be beaten before the fight even begins. This is the strategic dimension of silence that goes beyond psychology and into pure competitive advantage. In business, in negotiation, in creative work, in any domain where you are building something, silence about what you are building is power. The man who announces his plans invites interference. He invites competition, doubt, discouragement, theft. The man who works in silence and arrives with a finished product, a completed deal, a closed negotiation, he controls the reveal entirely. He decides what is shown and when. He cannot be preempted because no one knew to preempt him. This is not secrecy born of paranoia. It is strategy born of wisdom. There is a West African proverb: "Do not tell the world your plans, show it your results." This is not cynicism. It is a recognition that the world will not give you credit for what you are building until you have already built it. And the moment you announce what you intend to build, you have given the world the opportunity to tell you it won't work, and some part of you, the part that is still uncertain, will hear that and falter. Protect the vision by protecting the silence around it. Let it grow in the dark until it is strong enough to stand in the light. And then bring it into the room fully formed, and let the room try to argue with what already exists. Silence is how you move without being moved. Point 10. The man who masters silence masters himself. In 180 AD, Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, commander of the most powerful military force on earth, ruler of an empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, sat in a military tent on the Danube frontier and wrote these words to himself: "The first rule is to keep an untroubled spirit. The second is to look things in the face and know them for what they are. An untroubled spirit. Not an empty spirit. Not a passive spirit. Not a spirit that doesn't feel. A spirit that is not troubled, not rattled by noise, not destabilized by other people's chaos, not derailed by the uncontrollable." And this, more than any strategy, more than any technique, is what the mastery of silence ultimately produces. A man who cannot be troubled. Not because nothing reaches him, but because what reaches him passes through a filter of deliberate stillness before it becomes a response. Think of what your life would look like if you possessed this. If the next time someone disrespected you in public, instead of reacting, you simply held their gaze in silence, and let them feel the weight of what they'd said. If the next time you received bad news, instead of spiraling, you sat with it in quiet long enough to see the path forward. If the next time you were in a high-stakes meeting, you listened twice as long as you spoke and arrived at decisions that were clear, precise, and uncontaminated by the noise of the room. This is not a fantasy. This is a skill. A trainable, buildable, stackable skill. And like all real skills, it begins not with grand gestures but with small, daily commitments. You begin with 5 minutes of silence in the morning before the world enters. You practice holding your tongue in one conversation per day where you would normally have spoken. You let one provocation pass without response, just to feel what it feels like to have that power. You sit, at the end of the day, in enough quiet to actually hear yourself. And over time, slowly, the silence becomes native. It becomes your default. And the world begins to respond to you differently, because you have become different. Marcus Aurelius wrote late in his life: "Nowhere can man find a quieter or more untroubled retreat than in his own soul. Not in the mountains. Not in the monastery. In himself." This is the destination of everything we've covered today. Not a technique. Not a posture. A transformation. From a man who reacts to a man who responds. From a man who is controlled by noise to a man who chooses silence as his native state. From a man who needs the world's permission to feel powerful, to a man who carries the power inside him, in the quiet, where no one can touch it. The loudest rooms in the world are full of men who are afraid. Afraid of being overlooked. Afraid of being dismissed. Afraid that if they stop making noise, they will stop existing. And so they perform constantly, on social media, in meetings, in relationships, in every room they enter. Because they have not yet discovered what you are now beginning to understand, that the man who is comfortable in silence is comfortable with himself. And a man who is comfortable with himself needs nothing from the room. He does not need the room's approval. He does not need its attention. He does not need its noise. He is already complete. And that completeness, that stillness at the center of everything, is what everyone in the room feels when he walks in. It is what they cannot name but cannot ignore. It is authority that was never demanded. Respect that was never asked for. Power that was never announced. It is silence. And it is yours to master. If this reached something in you, if something here landed at a level below words, you already know what this channel is about. Subscribe to Inner Steel. Share this with one man who needs it. And come back. Because the work of building yourself into something unshakable is not a single video. It is a practice. A daily commitment. A life chosen deliberately. We will be here. In the silence. Waiting for the man you are becoming to arrive.